Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from SAGE, we're going to be talking about fake news and its impact on science and democracy. This one goes out to all the fans of InfoLit and, well, critical thinking. It seems like it wasn't that long ago that many of us were even barely aware that we were developing our critical thinking skills while we're in college. Now, critical thinking has become a more voluntary exercise, a skill that we suddenly appreciate having, and one, it seems, that might just save democracy itself. And those of you who are currently in college are receiving very intentional, purposeful instruction around critical thinking. Is this focus because of digital technology, business practices from mainstream and fringe media outlets, the breakdown of political norms, or all of the above and then some? Joining me to answer these questions in this four-part series are Dan Chibnall and Nick Anstead. Dan is a STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University, and Nick is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Both guests teach and write about misinformation and fake news in STEM and the social sciences. In this third episode of our series, we talk about specific instructional tactics for disempowering fake news and why technology's role in its spread isn't the only thing we need to worry about. All right, so let's talk about solutions here for a bit. And Dan, um, in your answer in the last episode, you mentioned psychomers, which I love that term. Can you talk about this in the context of your instruction? What have you identified as the key areas for education around science, democracy, and information consumption?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned earlier, I teach a number of courses. So, science communication, science fiction, science and democracy, misinformation, and the science and democracy course is sort of where a lot of that stuff kind of overlaps
Mm.
because we're trying to look at how do science and democracy sort of mirror each other. So, what do they have in common? How did they evolve? Like, why do they exist? This is a thing that we keep coming back to in that class, especially of why do we have certain laws or institutions or traditions within our cultures and societies that basically support something, right? Like, for example, one we look at in a number of my courses is, why does the United States Environmental Protection Agency exist, right? We didn't just one day, it just didn't exist. People saw a need for something, right? But the problem is that most people nowadays don't see the problem. The problem is invisible because, well, there's still a lot of problems, but a lot of the biggest problems are now invisible because they've been fixed or they're still being fixed, right? So a big part of this is making the invisible visible. So showing people why we have these things, what started them, right? So then we go even further back into history and look at, why was there a need or a desire to sort of promote the concept of democracy? What was happening to the human species in all these different places that people saw a need to throw off their old forms of government and create democracy, right? And somebody just didn't wake up and say, this sounds like a good idea, right? And science is the same way. We have a natural curiosity and desire to understand how things around us work, because at a root level, it helps us survive. And so you could make an argument. I mean, I don't think this is why science exists solely, but science is also a survival mechanism. It helps us to live longer, to be safe, right? So at its core, that's what I'm trying to do in this course and in some of my other courses, is to get people to see, why do we do the things that we do and why are they worth supporting, right? So, for example, like, one of the things that we talk about that science helps to support is this idea of information consumption. Like, how has our information consumption changed in the past 30, 50, 100 years, right? Where does our information come from? And I tell students, you have to understand the science of attention, how executive function in the brain works, how cognitive biases work. All of these things are essential to understanding where you take in information on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, right? We don't want to just walk around every day and just see food laying around and be like, oh, I'm hungry, I'll just eat this, right? But we do that so often with our information. we just see stuff and we take it in and just think, oh yeah, that thing, and we don't think about whether or not it's real or true or quality, right? So part of it at its core, if you want a democracy to work and if you want science to operate well, you have to have quality information. And so these things go hand in hand. Uh, and you can't just solve some of these like misinformation problems in both science and democracy by simply saying, well, just find better sources, right? Uh, you know, for example, you could argue that the events of January 6th in the United States wouldn't have happened if we had just given everybody better subscriptions to newspapers, right? It's not necessarily the quality of the information there's a deeper problem, right, that we have to sort of root into and look at historically.
Hmm.
So I try to help my students understand the science of focus and attention and how the mind works when it comes to information processing and how information creates our opinions and our ideas. And so there's a lot of scientific studies that we look at to help us understand that. And that helps us to understand how we can basically prevent things from attacking democracy as well. Because when people go after the guardrails of democracy or the rules that we've had for so long, democracy starts to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to look at sort of the foundational historical roots of this stuff. And sometimes that's in history and sometimes that's in science.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The importance of critical thinking there. Nick, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in here. Is there anything you want to follow up on in terms of key areas of instruction?
Well, I just one thing I wanted to emphasize, which I just completely agree with Dan on, is the importance of what we might term the guardrails. So, and this takes me back to the sort of institutional solutions to this problem, in the sense that the parts of a democratic system that actually protect you from things like January the 6th are not the most glamorous parts of the democratic system, right? It's things like electoral commissions. It's things like campaign finance regulation. These are the types of institutions that, and I'm sure we are also going to talk about things like media literacy and other solutions to this, but it's those institutional solutions that ultimately provide the safeguard, because they're the things that keep a democracy in place from election cycle to election cycle. And so when you start to see those coming under attack, that's the point where you need to be really worried.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of media literacy, I mean, that's a whole kind of course load in itself. I mean, Nick, do you want to just kind of expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so I know that one of the solutions that has been proposed, and there is some statistical evidence that it can help in some circumstances, although as always with these sort of things, it's complicated, and what happens when you transfer it into the real world and what might that transference look like, but is the idea of getting people to think about their media consumption, getting them to engage critically with content in a different way. And I guess we broadly put this under the umbrella of media literacy, and that takes a lot of different forms. And there's things like data literacy and digital literacy and all these different terminologies
right.
in the literature. I mean, I suppose the one thing I would sort of voice concern is too strong a word, because I'm strongly in favor of media literacy programs and it being thought about. And as a broader point, actually, one thing that really is disappointing in lots of countries, but certainly in the UK in recent years, have been attacks on the study of media and the idea that this isn't a serious academic undertaking. And we've certainly seen that in political discourse in the UK in recent years. So it's a very important subject to study. But I do think there is also a slight danger that we're putting emphasis on the individual there. We're saying, okay, here are the skills. Now you have to go out and survive in this space. And of course, we want to equip people with those skills, but the challenges also require regulatory response, legislative responses as well. And we shouldn't see media literacy as an alternative to that, but we should see it as complementary to that.
Can you explain that further? What do you mean by regulatory responses?
Well, this kind of brings us to the question of technology and where we place the blame for these events, and so one idea, I guess, that's often dominant or prominent in public discourse is the idea that this is a technological problem. And that gives me a few issues, I would say. The first of which is, I think it massively simplifies what the problem is, that we can't just explain events such as the growing popularity of populist politicians through a technological lens. But I think another problem is that it leads to a kind of sense of powerlessness, in the sense that we tend to think that technologies are things that just happen to us. So I would very often be keen to substitute, if we are going to talk about technologies, I would be keen to substitute the word technology for tech firms, because these are human actors who exist in a regulatory environment and they have shareholders and all these other things that normal firms have. And one of the things that's really striking, though, is how lots of things have happened without us really having a conversation about it. So let me give you a British example of this. And I appreciate this will be a little bit alien to your American listeners because the political setting is so different. But in the 1950s, in the UK, there was a conversation and it was decided that when commercial television was launched, that one thing that wouldn't be allowed on commercial television was political advertising. And there was a blanket ban on political advertising. And I think in retrospect, that looks like quite a good decision. Not least because it didn't provide that engine for increased political money and increased requirements for political funding. And obviously, the United States is the most extreme example of that.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the present day, political campaign managers in the UK now have access to what we could argue is the preeminent media advertising channel of today, if you argue it's replaced television, which is social media advertising. Yet we've never had a conversation as a society about how we wish to regulate or even consider saying, Facebook, you can't take political advertising on your platform. Now, that might seem like an outlandish suggestion, but is it any more outlandish than the previous regulations that were put in place historically? And the most astonishing thing, as I say, is we've never really even had a conversation as a society whether that's a good idea or whether we want to think about replicating the decisions that were taken around television advertising several decades ago. So I think that often when we think about technology, we kind of create a discourse which disempowers decision makers, regulators, the wider public, because these seem like unmanageable things. And obviously we can talk about tech firms and they seem pretty unmanageable because obviously they're so vast and powerful often.
Yep.
But they are still regulatable entities. And so at the very least, I would prefer to think of it in those terms.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Nick. Dan, I want to give you a chance to follow up on that because I know you've brought up technology in a couple different situations, scenarios. I mean, any thoughts on what Nick has just said?
Yeah, going back to something Nick started with, media literacy is important, but at the same time, when he was speaking there, the term silver bullet came into my head. This idea that we often think that there can be silver bullet solutions to some of these, information problems that we've been discussing, and I don't believe there are. I do in my heart of hearts believe that equipping people with these skills is important, but I don't go to bed at night thinking like, well, my work here is done and the problem is solved. Because we do, in the United States, we do need to, if we're going to make sure that democracy survives another generation, which, every generation's responsibility is to make sure it keeps running. It's not something that runs on its own. And the same thing with science. We have to have curious people who are willing to go and try things over and over again. So in order to do those things, we need to make sure that we have the right climates for them, right? The right rules for them. And, people laud the U.S. Constitution as being this, mighty document, that will save us all. But the fact of the matter is that it's one of the oldest in the world. And there are aspects of it that are not suited for the 21st century. And so the question is, what do we do about that? And yes, there's an amendment process, but if we're going to, make sure that these things survive, then we're going to need to amend some of these massive pieces of our institutions, right? We're going to need to basically rebuild the engine, right? So I'm not saying scrap the Constitution by any means, but
Right.
we need to basically make sure that the things that work, we push those forward. The things that are antiquated, that no longer work or we don't need anymore, well, how do we get rid of those? How do we improve those things? Because we are just as wise, if not wiser, than the people who wrote that document and lived in that time.
Hmm.
So why don't we trust our own selves and not just the past?
Right.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, it's basically there is some individual responsibility, but I think there's also a larger social, political responsibility to make sure that these things have the right environment to operate in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Dan, the last time this is your second appearance on our podcast, and the last time you were here was in 2020, where we talked in depth about misinformation surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, which you've actually brought up in this series as well. Just curious, has your teaching style or approach shifted since then? Or do the core principles stay the same even as different myths or disinformation campaigns evolve or gain attention?
Yeah, some of the core stuff has remained the same.
Yep.
Some of the things I've already mentioned that we still study that are important to know and understand. One of the things we always start out with is where's information come from? We take it for granted, but what is it and where does it come from? How is it different than data, knowledge, wisdom? We use these terms interchangeably, but these are
Right.
all different things. So, we still look at those kinds of things. Where's information come from? Who puts it out there? Who has the privilege of being able to process it and edit it, right? But some of the biggest changes that I've made are, to remind students and to sort of teach with examples of that in this era with all this technology, it's important to remember that you are not just a consumer of information, but you are also a sharer and you are also sometimes a creator. And for most of human history, that was not the case, right? You could be a sharer or a creator of, say, rumor within your local community, right? Or maybe you were one of those people who wrote a letter to the editor every week for your local newspaper, right? But those days, now you have basically, I'm for folks listening on the podcast, I'm holding up my smartphone. You have a significant weapon in your pocket to push information of any kind out to anyone you want, right? So with that comes a great responsibility, not to sound like a Spider-Man comic, but that comes with a massive responsibility. And so
Mhm.
you shouldn't just, tweet something or, post a TikTok of just like a bunch of random stuff that may go viral and then you have a problem, right? So understanding your role in an information ecosystem as a sharer and a creator, uh, knowing what studies tell us about how to have conversations and arguments and how to speak to other people about misinformation. For the longest time, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but for the longest time, we always assumed that if you just give people true information, they'll look at it and just be like, oh, I was wrong. Well, guess I'll just toss that opinion out the window. No, what we know from cognitive science is that people will often dig in on what they already believed. And so what do you do about that? You can't just present someone with a chart and say like, well, here's the data, here's a good example right now in the United States. For years now, there has been this myth that all the cities in the United States are being overrun with crime.
Mm.
Name a type of crime, and it's gone through the roof. Cities have burned to the ground, right? And yet, all the data we have that is collected very meticulously by many, many different agencies, the Department of Justice, the FBI, local police forces, show us that violent crime of every kind, except hate crimes, has gone down. But yet this myth just keeps propagating, right? So how do you have a conversation with people about that, right? Because it's gonna come up and you can't just show them the stats, right? So there are ways to have conversations about people with this. So we try to look at who talks about this stuff and how they do it. Build reaction habits to experiencing information so you don't get sucked in. And what I mean by that is so often, and I see this on my social media, like colleagues of mine who should know better. And I'm not saying I don't fall into this trap sometimes, but I see people who they will share something that's totally fake, 100% fake. And people are reacting and commenting and all this stuff. And I'm the one who has to dive in and be like, this isn't real. And then the person messages me and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I got duped, right? So build reaction habits. In other words, hold up, right? When you see something, don't just repost it. Don't just react to it. You need to basically slow your mind down just a little bit, right? A couple others real quick. Find what Elizabeth Neely, a great science communicator, she calls nerd nodes. Find nerd nodes. In other words, these are trusted networks of information. These are people that you know personally, people within your community. You can even be a nerd node. So basically that person within your community who people can turn to and ask, hey, Dan knows about science, or, oh, Nick knows about, communication and political stuff. And then they go to you and you can trust them, right? So find those people, but also hone your skills as a member of the nerd node.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is an academic one that the students always roll their eyes at until they understand what it means. And it's called epistemic trespassing. So this is where people, scholars, academics, people who are experts in their field, they suddenly think they can be an expert in something else. And again, not to use the pandemic as an example, but we had plenty of them. People who were an expert in one thing, like a sociologist, jumping in and being like, well, what you need to understand about the furin cleavage site of this particular viral, and it's like, hold on, man, you are not a virologist, right? So do not trespass on other people's epistemologies unless you really know what you're talking about. So beware of that. Know how to see it and know who to turn to instead.
You just heard from Dan Chibnall, STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University, and Nick Anstead, associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Sage. Join us next week for a final episode of this series when we'll be taking a look ahead and exploring the impact of AI-generated content, whether fact-checking in real time will remain a feature of our general media consumption, and how librarians can help students interpret information ahead of this year's elections. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, and digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.